My name is Daniel Hahn. I'm the Programme Director of the British Centre for Literary Translation, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the second day of the Ibby Congress. Today is the day when we're going to begin to explore one of the main themes of the Congress, which is translation. You will have seen, if you've looked through your programme, that we have a number of, I think, really interesting and varied ways of looking at translation over the next few days in the programme. But we're going to begin with a really fundamental question, which is, why translate children's books? Those of us who work as translators in the UK increasingly spend our time, I think, doing less and less actual translating, and spend more and more of our time doing what I call being a translator. And translating is one thing, and it's about conveying words from one language to another. Being a translator is something rather different in this country, and it's very much about talking about translation and appearing at literary festivals and writing about translation and teaching translation. And most importantly, I think, especially in a literary culture like ours, being an advocate for, being a champion of translation. And it's curious, I was thinking this morning that we actually very rarely ask ourselves this very basic question: why translate? And specifically for today, why translate children's books? This will, I think, set a number of points on the agenda for what we're going to talk about for the next few days. I can think of no one better qualified to speak on this subject. So I'm delighted to introduce to you a very distinguished award-winning researcher and writer on children's literature, and the author of comparative children's literature. Please join me in welcoming Professor Emer.
Thank you, Daniel, for your very kind and generous words of welcome. Water down. It's a great honor for me to speak here today to such an impressively international audience of advocates of children's literature. I've been told to speak slowly, which goes very much against my natural disposition, so I'll try my best. So I'll apologize to the interpreters in advance in case I speed. Oh, one of them is thanking me already in her little box. I'll do my best to speak slowly. Why translate children's books? Everyone in this hall has probably at least one good answer to that question. They might range from amazement that such an obvious question should be asked, or such an irreverent one, to the correct observation that translation has played a key role in the history and development of the children's literature of every country and language area, that it enriches the target literature, and it introduces children to foreign cultures. Jella Lepman, one of the founders of Ibby and fearless advocate of tolerance and international understanding through children's books, relates an incident in her autobiographical Kinderbuchbrücke, in English, Bridge of Children's Books, which shows why she personally translated a book in post-war Germany in 1946. Her famous international children's book exhibition, put together under the most adverse circumstances, was attracting huge numbers of visitors, and coming up to Christmas, she was finding it, I quote, harder than ever to turn down children who begged for books. She hits on the idea of translating Munro Leaf's and Robert Lawson's pacifist fable, Ferdinand the Bull, into Ferdinand der Stier, and convinces the authorities to print it on newspaper, as paper was scarce. Folded, it was made into a simple book, given to the children for free, and was, and I quote Jella Lepman, a spectacular success. Soon the story of Ferdinand could be heard being told on every street corner in Berlin. The first edition was out of print in the wink of an eye, and not even a copy remained for the files. We paid dearly to buy some back from the black market, where Ferdinand finally wound up as a prize object, end of quote. She was happy, to have created the perfect Christmas gift through translation for the book-starved children of Berlin. Posed in a different tone of voice, in a different place, and at a different time in history, the question in my title can have a very different ring. Why bother to translate children's books? In the English-speaking world, familiar arguments are There are more than enough good books in English. We don't need translations. They cost money and are too great a publishing risk. The resistance to translations in Britain and America was succinctly put by the children's publisher Dorothy Briley, who, as Aidan Chambers tells us, remarked how the words translated from the insert language on the title page of a book, I quote, is code for admire but don't buy it. These two very different approaches touch on aspects of what I would like to talk about today. I offer them as preliminary answers to the question, why translate children's books? But within this very sentence, we find a number of other questions implied. Why isn't the only question lurking in the title of my talk. Let's look at it again, proceeding in reverse order, and start with children's books. What are children's books, if you're asking why translate them? What are they? What kind of texts belong to the corpus of children's literature? Then if we take the verb translate for whom? Translate how to translate children's books. And then to the only question word in the question, the why, it can be broken down further into agents and into context. The context, we can ask about the socio-economic context, why children's books are translated. We can ask about the historical context, the cultural context. And if we look at the agents and ask why translate children's literature, we can ask for answers, the publishers, the editors, mediators, translators, and authors. In this presentation, I would like briefly to visit the stations indicated by all these questions, to give a kind of a mini guided tour around translated children's books, what they are, how and why they are or aren't translated, and by whom. Of course, I'll only have time to discuss one or two examples per item. I would like to look at the very different reasons for and motivation of people and organizations who are involved in translating, publishing, encouraging, or disseminating translated texts for children. So we'll start with children's literature and with the what. It's easier to say what children's books are not. Children's books are not a homogeneous body of texts characterized by features of content, style, or form shared by every book in the corpus. Their only common denominator is that they are texts assigned to children by adults. The noun children's books or children's literature denotes a broad and diverse range of texts with different sources, different addressees, forms, genres, different degrees of linguistic and aesthetic elaborateness, and functions. The material comes from a number of different sources. Folklore, folk and fairy tales, here we have an example from the Grimms, books originally for adults and subsequently adapted for children, and material authored specially for children. Its addressees range from infants through middle graders to young adults. Adults who read as mediators or for their own pleasure can also be addressees, especially in so-called crossover books. Its forms include picture books, pop-up books, anthologies, novels, merchandising tie-ins, novelizations, and multimedia texts. Amongst its genres are adventure stories, drama, science fiction, poetry, and information books. Its degrees of linguistic complexity range from concept books with a single noun per page to sophisticated, or through beginner readers, to sophisticated adolescent novels. You see an example here by Aidan Chambers, who'll be following me. Its functions and notions of artistry vary from texts defined by their degree of linguistic difficulty and their function of promoting literacy, when you think, for example, of children's first reading books, through texts in which content, is more important than form. Information books belong to this category, openly educational or didactic stories. Through material whose sole purpose is to amuse and to entertain, to intellectually and aesthetically stimulating and challenging texts, such as the elaborate, often experimental literary children's literature, which has become widespread in northwestern European countries and the United States over the past 50 or 60 years. The noun children's literature or children's books therefore denotes a plurality of coexisting textual manifestations and forms. To privilege any of these at the expense of the others, or to define the domain of children's literature with reference only to one of them, is to ignore the rich and necessary diversity of this branch of literature. Imagine the difference between translating a book for infants about animals that live on a farm, a humorous novel full of wordplay for middle graders, a psychological novel for adolescents, or a volume of poetry, for instance. Not all of these forms are seen by publishers as equally attractive for translation. I'll give an example of one area only. Amongst the most lucrative in the Anglophone world would seem to be picture books. Almost 2 out of every 3 translations published for children in English are picture books. They are thought of as requiring less in the way of translation and offer greater opportunities for international co-production, which makes them a more economical venture than a text publication for older readers. Whereas many Anglophone editors are dependent on readers' reports for text-based projects, the decision to publish a picture book can easily be taken on the basis of the artwork. And what about the text? Sometimes the editors revise basic translations provided by the publisher of the source text. Sometimes they fall in love with illustrations and buy the translation rights, despite feeling that the text might not be successful in the British or American market. In these cases, they may write completely new texts to, in the words of the American literary agent Kendra Marcus, to, I quote, more accurately reflect what is being portrayed in those illustrations. In other words, they tell a story they feel goes with the pictures in a way they think is appropriate for their target readers, possibly aligned more closely to narrative traditions, norms, and expectations of the target rather than the source literature. Gillian Lathey reported on how a Japanese student once surprised her classmates in a translation seminar by telling them that the English version of a Japanese picture book, which, and I quote Gillian Lathey, appeared to be a joyous account of a birthday party, was in the original quite a tragic little tale. The book in question was Chihiro Iwasaki's Yukinogi no Tanjubi, I hope I'm pronouncing that okay, in which the protagonist Chi-chan, who is about 5, goes to a party and accidentally blows out her friend's birthday party. Her friend's birthday candles. Here's the critical scene. This isn't a black and white copy. The incident has drained the color out of the scene for Chi-chan, who says, and I'd like to thank Tomoko Masaki, who is here today, who was the Japanese student that Gillian Lathey referred to, for translating the Japanese for me into English. Tomoko's translation, puff, oh, I blew out the candles by mistake. And then the little friends join in like a Greek chorus. Oh dear, Chi-chan has blown out the candles. She blew out her friend's candles. It's not your birthday today. The book goes on to describe her subsequent distress about the mishap. She runs away from the party before coming to a consoling end. In the text of the anonymous English translation, in which the title character is called Momoko, the candles are actually blown out by the child whose birthday it is. It's very dark now, Hanako has blown out her candles. And then on a very light note, let's play blind man's buff. While the Japanese text describes the girl's depressed feelings about her own birthday party the following day, with muted pictures that show her desolation, I don't like birthdays. I don't want anything. I don't want anyone to come to my house. In the English version, she happily wonders, I wonder what presents I get. I would love a doll to keep my dear Mio company. That's her dog. I would make clothes for them both. Here, the translator displays an astonishing lack of sensitivity towards the language of pictures. Such editorial freedom can spoil the most attractive aspect of the genre, the synergetic connection between word and image. The more intricate the interplay, the more complex the task of translation, as I have documented elsewhere. It is in this area that the greatest transgressions take place with translations. But by saying that, I have moved from the what of children's books to the how and for whom of translation. The questions for whom and how are, of course, interrelated. The answer to the question, translate for whom, may seem pretty obvious for children of whatever age or young adults, depending on the source text. But it's not quite as simple as that. As remarked earlier, children's books are books which are assigned to children by adults. They are defined by their audience and by those who address that audience. The unequal or asymmetrical relationship which arises from the assignment of texts by adults to children is a constituent element from which many of the essential differences between children's and adult literature derive. Addressed to young readers, children's literature is written, translated, published, reviewed, and recommended by adults. Adult librarians administer children's books, teachers use and encourage the use of them. They're purchased by parents, uncles, aunts, etc. This mediating role of adults is a vital one, without which children would have no books at all. But a children's book must gain adult approval if it is to be recommended or translated, and it must be regarded as appropriate for the children in the target culture. Amongst the differences or distances between adults and children which have to be bridged in children's books are command of language, experience of the world, and experience of literature. Children's literature must therefore adapt to the needs, capabilities, and interests of its readers. It adapts language and subject matter and formal and thematic features to correspond to the children's stage of development, the repertory of skills they have already acquired, and their interests. When it comes to translation, this means that developmental issues and the actual receptive ability of child readers are at the heart of children's literature translation, and these are connected to a central paradox. It's commonly held that books are translated in order to enrich a target literature and to introduce children to foreign cultures, yet, at the same time, foreign elements are often eradicated from translations, heavily adapted to their target culture, allegedly on the grounds that young readers won't understand them. Many translated texts tend to underestimate child readers, wanting to protect them from being over-challenged. Translating children's literature is therefore a balancing act between adapting foreign elements to the child reader's level of comprehension and to what is deemed appropriate, and preserving the differences that constitute a translated foreign text's potential for enrichment of the target culture. The decisions made by editors and translators in this zone of conflicting aims are determined by their assessment of child readers. The implied reader of a translation is therefore always a different entity from the implied reader of the source text, and is constructed according to the answers translators and publishers provide in a given time and a given culture to questions such as, what do children want to read? What are their cognitive and linguistic capabilities? How far can or should they be stretched? What is suitable for them? What do they enjoy? What children actually understand and how much foreignness they can and do cope with is the great black box of translating for children. As Gillian Leahy rightly remarks, a greater emphasis on empirical research into reader response would inform current speculation. Other determining factors on how children's books are translated are the norms in the target culture, what is deemed acceptable for children there. Children's literature is inscribed by dominant social, cultural, and educational norms. These shape the selection of source texts and the strategies used to translate them. Linguistic norms, for instance, which govern the use of proper language, playful misspellings are very often corrected in translation, norms of characterization and appropriate conduct, or norms relating to physicality can also influence how a text is translated, what parts of the body and which of its functions may be shown in a picture book, for instance. A famous historical example relating to norms of characterization and appropriate conduct is Astrid Lindgren's Pippi Longstrump, published in 1945. General suspicion of such a rebellious, subversive little girl led to modifying changes in many translations. In one instance, Pippi's supernatural strength is reduced to what must have seemed to the French publishers a more appropriate level. Instead of lifting a horse, Fifi Brin d'Acier can only lift up a pony. When Astrid Lindgren protested, the French publisher said, "It might be possible to persuade good little Swedish children that someone is capable of picking up a horse, but French children who've just been through a world war had too much common sense to swallow such a tall tale." Astrid Lindgren reacted by asking the publisher to see a photograph of a French child holding a pony in the air. But for some reason, the publisher never provided one. The strict policy in modern US children's literature of not depicting nudity, irrespective of whether of children, adults, or even animals, is well known. In Pia Lindenbaum's Swedish picture book, Elsa Marie and Her Little Papas, about a girl with 7 tiny fathers, the final illustration shows the little men, Elsa Marie and her normal-sized mother, all playing naked in the bath together. In the US translation, this picture was entirely cut and nothing was substituted. As long as the distribution of the book is restricted to US audiences, the suppression remains within national boundaries. But what happens in co-productions? If they want to generate enough sufficient sales to be financially viable, most picture books published outside of the United States now need what Martin Salisbury calls, I quote, that holy grail, the co-edition. A book published jointly by different publishers in more than one country, but most importantly in the United States. This means that the norms and values of the dominant partner are increasingly dictated what may and may not be shown in a picture book. In the British picture book, A Squash and a Squeeze, the sight of a seated goat, complete with udder, seemed obscene to the co-producing US publishers. Here on the cover, you see the goat with an udder, and in this picture, the udder is gone. See the udderless goat. The illustrator Axel Scheffler had to amputate it. He later produced this graphic commentary on the case. However, the goat lost her udder not just in the American version, but also in the British source text and in all other European and non-European versions involved in the co-production of the picture book for international editions. In this way, US norms governing the depiction of physicality found their way into Britain, the country of origin of the book, through the back door of co-production. The consequence? Authors and publishers are influenced by economic pressure in a highly competitive international market not to include any features which may not be acceptable to US publishers. And it's not only udders and the like that are disposed of. As Martin Salisbury notes in his Bookbird article with the title, "No Red Buses, Please," I quote, all manners of spurious do's and don'ts for illustrators have sprung up in British picture book editor's office. end of quote, which is leading to the loss of books with specific regional characteristics, the peculiarities of place, as he calls them, which are deemed unacceptable or incomprehensible for international audiences. Valerie Coughlin and Siobhan Parkinson remarked in their editorial to that Bookbird issue, and I quote, "If we lose country and culture-specific references, not only is it sad for the country or culture concerned, but it's also a loss for children who are being denied the experience of books that reflect cultural, ethnic, and social customs and ways of life different from their own." End of quote. Such culturally bland books ultimately make the task of the translator a lot easier, probably also a lot less interesting. But with their reduction of diversity, they reduce their attractiveness as products of a specific culture. And this brings us back to the question, why translate children's books? Moving to the why, I'll first look at the context, the socio-economic context, and then the cultural and historical context, starting with a brief look at the trade balance in terms of countries that export and those that import translations. When Paul Hazard wrote his influential survey, Les livres, les enfants et les hommes, with the English title Books, Children and Men, in the 1930s, he formulated his vision of international exchange of children's books as follows, and I quote, "Every country gives and every country receives. Innumerable are the exchanges." End of quote. There were no statistics around then to refute this claim, and many countries lay outside the radar of his study, but we can certainly say today that not every country gives and not every country receives. The proportion of translations in children's literature varies greatly, ranging from 1% to around 80%. The countries that give or export the most also receive or import the least. They are Great Britain with approximately 3% and the USA with approximately 1%, the leaders in the production tables of children's literature. In the developed children's literatures, the Scandinavian countries top the list as those who are most welcoming to literature produced outside their linguistic areas, with Finland leading at around 80%. Figures for the Netherlands and Italy are above 40%, and Germany produces about 30% translations. So there are countries which mainly export children's books while only importing very few, and there are countries which are in the reverse situation. They provide a market for the global corporations. 70 to 90% of books available to reading children in non-European, non-American cultures are by European or American authors. But books from these cultures rarely cross the linguistic, political, or cultural divide to partake in the Western market. A few organizations and individual publishers actively address this situation and undertake to distribute books from distant countries, and I will come back to them in a moment. These countries literally import the books. They're distributed in the original rather than being translated into a vernacular language. The translation issues that I've been talking about so far must surely appear luxurious in the eyes of such countries. Rather than engaging with translation, they're struggling to produce any kind of children's literature at all. In the developing countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the situation in 2010 is described as follows by Michael David Ambachu in a chapter in the Routledge Handbook of Research on Children's and Young Adult Literature. Weak publishing sectors, inadequate distribution mechanisms, and poor purchasing power all contribute to a severe shortage of quality indigenous reading materials, making the acquisition of reading and sustaining of reading nigh impossible for all but the elite. He goes on to ask whether international publishers are more devoted to their profits and thus view Africa as a small export market rather than a partner in the publishing arena whom they should support and mentor and with whom they can collaborate, end of quote. He writes that on estimate, Africa imported $769 million worth of books from the EU alone between 1988 and 1991, Add to these the millions of books donated by organizations such as Book Aid International, and one can see how difficult it is for African publishers, especially in smaller local languages, to become economically viable and produce a sustained supply of suitable storybooks. These are the countries which neither export nor translate into their indigenous languages. They're simply markets for the globalized publishing industry. At this stage, I have to return to the statistics that I mentioned to slightly demystify them. As Daniel Hahn remarks on the Book Trust Translated Fiction website, 3%, we're talking about the proportion of British translations, 3% of a huge market is a lot more in terms of actual numbers of titles than, say, 30% of a market in a country which produces significantly fewer books. He also rightly says that it's more important to look at the quality of books and the variety that readers read. He would like to see more readers of English language writers from cultures in Africa and Asia, for instance, and I heartily agree with both of these points. But when we continue the quality issue and go to look for books in English by the winners of prestigious international prizes, for instance, the results can be sobering. The Brazilian author Ligia Bojunga Nunes, one of the very few to have won both the Hans Christian Andersen Award in 1982 and the Astrid Lindgren Memorial Award in 2004, has written around 20 novels for children, books which combine magic realism and acute psychological observation with a passion for democracy and social justice. They have been translated into several languages, but only 2 have been translated into English, 2 out of 20, The Companions and My Friend the Painter. Translations of some of the others would indeed enrich children's literature in English. By the same token, when we see literatures with impressive figures of 40% to 80% translation, we also have to be cautious in our optimism. A study by Mieke Desmet of translated fiction for girls into Dutch from the middle to the end of the 20th century questions the assumption that a large proportion of translated work within a language is solely an indication of quality and openness to other cultures. The growth both in numbers of translations from English, they now make up more than 70% of the translated titles, as well as the share of formula fiction series such as The Babysitter Club and Sweet Valley High, which make up over 50% of the titles translated, refute, and I quote Desmet, the often quoted but seldom sustained claim that translation brings the best of children's literatures from many cultures to young readers in other cultures. It's worth noting here that UNESCO's Index Translationum lists Walt Disney as the most translated children's author worldwide. If we return to the difference between countries in the numbers of their translations, we may find at least a partial explanation in cultural and historical factors. The state of development of a children's literature, for example, can be a key factor. The 80% proportion of translations of children's literature in Finland has to do with the situation of a literature which cannot look back on a long tradition of writing in its own language, so it depends on translation to enrich and expand its literary possibilities. When a language is revived and becomes the official language of the new state, children are rightly recognized as its future. The provision of a rich children's literature in this language becomes a matter of priority in terms of language politics. As Zohar Shavit tells us, modern Hebrew extended itself by importing titles from other countries. Later, the number of translations actually decreased in proportion to indigenous literary development. Another example, in the 1980s, Galician, after centuries of marginalization in Spain, and I quote, was recognized for the first time as the national language of Galicia. Due to the change in status, as Carmen Melan Valera writes, I quote, especially after the language became a compulsory subject at school, there was a high demand for books in Galician, particularly children's and teenage books. End of quote. Texts targeted at children and teenagers constituted over 80% of the translation production in the 1980s, illustrating the central importance of this segment to the market. Translations were need to fill gaps in the Galician publishing world, whose own production was not yet able to satisfy the demand. In addition to the commitment on the part of the publishing houses, there was also an economic impulse behind this trend, a guaranteed market. Milan Valera concludes that children's literature translation activities, and I quote, in a peripheral context, such as Galician, appear to be highly determined by their context and, therefore, strongly related to questions of ideology and identity, as well as being inevitably subject to economic constraints and market criteria, end of quote. So there are very different cultural reasons why children's books may be translated or not, and this sometimes can be triggered by a fairly mundane thing, such as a copyright expiring, as in the case of Saint-Exupéry's crossover novel The Little Prince in 1994. 3 new translations, English translations, were published immediately on expiry of the copyright, and a 4th followed in the year 2000 on the centenary of his birth by the poet Richard Howard. Other cultural factors which support translation or retranslation include a film version or a TV series being launched, where the translation can serve as a tie-in. And sometimes, unlikely as it may seem, it may come about because of a single young reader. A spectacular, relatively recent translation success story shows how it is possible with determination and devoted readers to break into the English language market. A German girl living in London wrote an indignant letter to Barry Cunningham, the discoverer of J.K. Rowling, to ask why English friends couldn't read her favorite book, Herr der Diebe, by Cornelia Funke, an adventure story with a Venetian setting. To try to find a way into the English market, Funke, a successful author in Germany, but at that point still unknown in the English-speaking world, had, as it happens, already had a translation done at her own expense by her cousin, which Cunningham read and subsequently published. It went on to win the Bachelor Award the following year, was released as a major film in 2006, and it, as well as subsequent novels by Funke, stormed the New York Times children's bestsellers, earning Funke the epithet Germany's J.K. Rowling. The German girl rightly deserved the gratitude expressed in the publisher's preface to The Thief Lord, and I quote, and a special thank you to Clara Bagenal-George, who first told us about Cornelia Funke and her books, end of quote. The market criteria just mentions brings us to the agents of translation, directly to the publishers. Publishing is a business. I didn't want to mention you-know-who too often, but Harry Potter was, of course, a magical pot of gold for many foreign publishers, even after they paid a fortune for the rights. And as we know from reports about contemporary developments in different countries, for instance, in the Bookbird article by Tang Rui about Chinese children's literature in the 21st century, children's publishing almost everywhere has become even more market-driven since the success of Rowling's series. Children's authors complain that now, in the aftermath of the phenomenally successful novels, the goalposts in terms of sales have shifted, which is influencing the production of a wide variety of books. This polarization of the market into an all-or-nothing situation where everyone is chasing the next big global seller means the pressure is on for huge commercial success, and that the middle titles, where many translations are situated, are squeezed out. The most striking changes in children's culture in the Western countries over the past few decades have been its commercialization and its globalization. The conditions of literature for children have changed. The children's book industry is increasingly dominated by a handful of large media conglomerates for whom publishing is a small section of their entertainment business. This leads, for instance, to backlists being mined for instantly recognizable characters and stories that offer strong merchandising possibilities. More than 200 companies worldwide currently license Beatrix Potter merchandising, from Pearson plc making it the largest international literary licensed merchandising program. Pearson also sells licenses for Spot by Eric Hill and for Madeleine by Ludwig Bellemans. Noddy, Thomas the Tank Engine, and Curious George can also be experienced through a wide range of non-book products. As Daniel Haid observes, and I quote, "The mass marketplace selects which books will survive, and thus the children's book becomes less a cultural and intellectual object and more an entertainment looking for mass appeal." The international influence of these multimedia giants is immense, manufacturing mass-produced goods for children. They coordinate their strategies beyond the borders of individual countries. Figures for translating what have ultimately become tie-in books boost the translation statistics. If we move from the extreme end of the spectrum, from multimedia giants to the opposite end, where we find publishers and organizations whose motives are primarily altruistic or idealistic, in between we pass small to medium-sized publishers who can be very enthusiastic about translations. One is the legendary Klaus Flugge of Anderson Press, also Dagmar Hermann of Wellington Publishing, Jill Evans from Egmont, Aurora Metro Publishing, to mention but a few, and probably get myself into trouble for omitting others. On the homepage of the relatively new picture book publishers company, Phoenix Yard Books, you can read, I quote, "In order to find exciting, original children's books, we sometimes need to look outside of our own borders, and this is why we place a high value on translation, particularly, but not exclusively, from the French," end of quote. Altruistic publishers and organizations work to make voices heard from countries which provide a market for multinational corporations, but whose own books rarely cross the linguistic, political, or cultural divide. They actively address this situation and undertake to distribute books from distant countries, amongst them the Swiss charitable organization Baobab Books. Baobab Books are, according to their mission statement, and I quote, "committed to activities that will both promote respect for people of other backgrounds or beliefs and equal opportunities throughout the global community," end of quote. And they see the book as an educational and cultural medium, as a particularly well-suited vehicle for this purpose. Their work includes translating and publishing texts in German exclusively by authors from Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. Amongst their most recent publications are Ambar Past and Marok Mendes Perez, Tamana Araki's Als die Sonne ein Kind war, When the Sun was a Child, a Mexican Maya creation myth, and a collection of stories from Cameroon by Henry Mbaga. One of their back titles was the wonderful bilingual Das Notizbuch des Zeichners, the illustrator's notebook by the Egyptian Moeddin El-Abad, which presents the original text in Arabic with the German translation in the margin. A similar answer to the question why he translates children's books is given by the Danish publisher, Van Pleng, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, proprietor of the Forlaget Hewlett, the Wheel Press, who since 1976 has been purchasing translation rights and books from countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Oceania, which he calls collectively the warm countries, and initiating co-productions. At the Ibby conference in New Delhi in 1998, he said it was, and I quote, "in order to publish books that bring in stories and or pictures, images from other cultures, to promote understanding, appreciation, and respect for other people and their values and way of life," end of quote. Cultural bridge building work is what he calls it. But he also draws attention to the paradox that many librarians and teachers praise him for publishing these original books in Scandinavian languages, saying they are really needed, but they don't actually buy them, saying that in their originality they are too difficult for children to understand. The same kind of idealism just mentioned is familiar to most of you here, as cultural bridge building work is at the very heart of what Ibby is about. since it was founded in 1953. It is the home of mediators and ambassadors for what is sometimes called the International Children's Literature Movement, and with the Ibby Honour List works towards increasing the number of translations and foreign editions of excellent children's books. A similar function is served by the White Ravens, an annual selection of recent international children's books recommended for translation by the International Youth Library in Munich, which continues the work of its founder, Jelle Leppmann. Amongst the famous names in the ranks of the ambassadors of children's literature are Paul Azar and Jelle Leppmann, whom I already mentioned, Mildred L. Batchelder, children's librarian and later executive director of the Association for Library Service to Children, and believer in the importance of good books for children in translation from all parts of the world, is another. The major translation award for children's books instigated in the USA in 1968 was named for her, and in Britain the counterpart, to raise the profile of translated children's literature since 1996, is the biennial Marsh Award. If we move on to translators and authors as mediators, we have to say that translators are the unsung and usually underpaid heroes and heroines of international culture exchange, of enrichment via literary texts, and often we don't even know who they are. Of the English translation of Heinrich Hoffmann's Struwwelpeter into English, by far the most successful in terms of numbers of editions and imitations was the first, issued in 1848. Some of its hyperbole and drama rendered the English verses actually more comical than the German original, such as the mock-pitiful mode in the introductory couplet to the dreadful story about Harriet and the Matches. It almost makes me cry to tell what foolish Harriet befell. Why did this translator translate Struwwelpeter? We don't know. We don't even know who the translator was. He or she is unnamed and has remained unidentified, a not uncommon fate for translators of children's literature before the mid-20th century. The lack of accreditation of translators, corresponding to the general low status of children's books, makes them what Gillian Lathey has called the great disappeared of literary history. Lathey, in her superb study, The Role of Translators in Children's Literature, Invisible Storytellers, which was published in 2010, goes about making the translators less invisible and casts light into the dark history of why translators translate. Financial reward and status, especially for pre-20th century women, naturally play a role, but translators' prefaces and other paratexts often reveal a motivation based on the texts themselves. Mary Wollstonecraft, an early example of one of the many authors for children who also translated Christian Gotthilf Salzmann's Stories of Everyday Life in the late 18th century, and I quote Gillian Lathey, because their moral messages matched those in her own publications for children, end of quote. And by translating Grimm's fairy tales into English, Edgar Taylor, again I quote Lathey, was determined that his translation should reintroduce imaginative stories into children's lives, end of quote. Children's writers in their own right who translate children's books as a secondary activity are common in some languages. For instance, in German, Miriam Pressler, a prize-winning author and translator from Hebrew and Dutch, including the work of Bart Moyaert, who will be following me here, is a good example. And there's the famous case of one Hans Christian Andersen prize-winning author, Ana Maria Machado, who translated another, Catherine Patterson, into Brazilian. In English, where it has become less common, we have, for example, Joan Aiken, who retranslated the Comtesse de Ségur's stories Angel Inn because she encountered them as a child, read in French by her mother. Another, more recent and unusual example of an author turned translator and publisher is Siobhan Parkinson, Ireland's first laureate for children's literature, who is on this year's Ibby Honour List as a translator. She became involved in publishing with a new imprint, Little Island, which was introduced in 2010 with the joint aims of fostering new Irish writing and, something totally new in the world of Irish children's publishing in English, issuing translations. The first list included 2 titles by German authors translated by Parkinson herself. It's an important symbolic step that shows, even if only on a small scale, that increased worldwide interest in Irish children's books can be met with an Irish awareness of the diversity of other children's literatures. So authors may work as translators and publishers, and even sometimes, as in the case of the second of the 2 authors who will take over here in a minute or two, as a publisher who specializes exclusively in translation. Aidan Chambers, champion of translated fiction, was co-founder in the early 1990s of the short-lived publishers Turton and Chambers, which specialized in English translations of European fiction for young people. But you will want to hear Aidan tell you about his career as a publisher himself, so I will now conclude my talk. My conclusion starts with a lengthy quote, and one which some of you will probably know already. Back in 1968, Anna Pelovsky, founding director of the Information Center of Children's Cultures of the US Committee for UNICEF, published The World of Children's Literature, an extensive annotated bibliography on the development of children's literature in every country. And she wrote, I quote, "There has been a tremendous increase in the number of translations and exchanges, but the greatest proportion has involved the dozen or so countries which produce 3/4 of the world's books. Exchanges among these countries are not to be disparaged because there is as much need for understanding among them as there is anywhere else. Yet, may it not be true that the commercial and governmental channels are so taken up with the volume of materials to be contended with from these dozen countries that they have no time, patience, or resources left to explore sufficiently the possibilities of exchange with their neighboring nations and with others passing through the same phases of development? Are the private and governmental publishers too concerned with the profits, both monetary and ideological, of exchange to the detriment of quality? Is there sufficient exchange between the economically advanced and the developing countries, or is this pretty much a one-way passage? What can possibly be the results of world education which relies on so few countries for its textbooks and materials? Will it work for the common good and for mutual understanding, or will it rather stifle the creative impulse to search for new and better forms? The massive programs of international aid in the production of reading and teaching materials would do well to consider these questions more carefully." End of quote. Enthusiastic in her commitment to international children's literature, Anne Pelovsky expressed her doubts about the existence of a truly international dimension in the exchange of children's literature. The assessment of this far-sighted woman has lost little of its pertinence today. What I have tried to do within the limits of the time allotted is to show the multitude of different, at times conflicting forces and interests at work behind the seemingly simple question, why translate children's books? No less heterogeneous than the types of texts and the different addressees contained in the noun children's books are the translation strategies, the contexts, and the people which influence or even determine promotion and translation of children's books. We've briefly visited literatures which consider themselves so rich that they feel little need to search beyond their vast linguistic borders, and others which struggle to establish themselves in difficult circumstances. The passionate belief in the importance of translators by an ambassador like Ibby founder Jelle Lepman immediately after the shock of the Second World War, even though it might seem full of pathos today, hasn't lost its justification. We just have to combine this pathos with a sobering look at commercial and geopolitical realities. I would like to end on an upbeat note with a quotation from Astrid Lindgren, a true believer in the creative partnership between child reader and translator, which Gillian Lathy cites as a tribute to the work of all translators. I believe that children have a marvellous ability to re-experience the most alien and distant things and circumstances if a good translator is there to help them. And I believe that their imagination continues to build where the translator can go no further. Thank you.